The first time Daniel Hargrove spoke to Sophie Calloway, he didn't introduce himself. He didn't smile the practiced smile of a therapist or extend a hand the way strangers do when they want to seem safe. He just crouched down beside her wheelchair, looked at the rigid brace clamped around her legs, and asked one quiet question. "Does it hurt?" Sophie was 8 years old. She had sat across from 47 specialists in her short life doctors, with diplomas on every wall and certainty in every sentence. Not one of them had ever asked her that. She looked at him, something shifted behind her eyes. Not hope, not yet, but the door to it, opening just a crack. The Calloway estate sat on the north edge of Lincoln Park, 3 stories of pale limestone behind a wrought iron gate that took 10 seconds to open and felt every single time like it was reminding you that different rules applied here. 12 rooms, more, if you counted the ones that had been converted into something clinical, a therapy suite on the 2nd floor, an equipment storage room off the east hallway, a sensory space at the far end of the 3rd floor corridor that smelled of lavender and cost more to outfit than most people spent on a car. Sophie Calloway had access to all of it. She used almost none of it. What she used was the window seat at the end of the 2nd floor hall, wide, padded in pale gray fabric, looking out over the back garden. She sat there most mornings with a sketch pad on her knees and her pencils lined up in the order she'd decided they belonged. She didn't use the therapy suite. She didn't use the sensory room. She sat at the window and drew, and for 4 months she had done this in complete silence, not speaking to anyone in the house beyond a yes or no when the housekeeper, Mrs. Aldridge, asked if she was hungry. Serena Calloway was 33 years old and had been running Calloway Biogroup for 4 years. She had taken over the company the same week she buried her husband, which was the same week she understood she was going to have to do everything: the grief, the company, the daughter without anyone to hand any of it back to. Thomas had died of a stroke on a Wednesday afternoon in October. He was 31. He had been on a conference call when it happened, and the call had continued for 15 minutes before someone finally said his name and got no answer. Sophie's diagnosis had come 2 years before that: mild spastic diplegia, a form of cerebral palsy affecting her legs, making certain movements effortful in ways other children never had to consider. Her cognitive function was completely intact. Her mind was sharp, curious, precise. It was her body that required accommodation, not her intellect. Serena had told herself she understood this, and then she had spent 4 years and $8 million on therapists, specialists, and bracing systems in the way of someone who understood something slightly different, that the problem was one that could be solved if she just found the right solution. The problem was that Sophie had stopped cooperating 4 months ago, not in a door-slamming way, in a quieter, more final way, the way a person stops arguing not because they've been convinced but because they've decided the argument isn't worth having anymore. After a session in which Dr. Conniff, Renata Voss had referred to Sophie, in front of Sophie, as a textbook presentation of compensatory movement patterns. Sophie had closed her sketchbook, placed her pencils in their case, and not spoken more than 2 words to anyone in the house since. Daniel Hargrove arrived on a Monday morning in the first week of November, driving a white work truck with a dent in the passenger door he'd been meaning to fix for 8 months. He was 38, with the build that came from actual physical work, wide shoulders, forearms that showed lean muscle from daily use. He had gray at his temples that had appeared the year his wife died and spread slowly since. He was there to restore the library on the ground floor, floor-to-ceiling oak shelving that had dried and cracked, the joinery separating at the corners. He brought Caleb because Caleb's school had a teacher workday, and there was no other arrangement. Caleb was 9 and constitutionally incapable of moving through any space quietly. Serena appeared at the top of the staircase with her phone in her hand. "You brought your son to a client's home," she said. Daniel looked up at her without the reflexive apology she was accustomed to receiving. "His school is closed today. I didn't have another option." He said it the way someone might explain that it was raining, factual, without performance. "He'll stay out of your way." Serena stood still for a moment. She was not used to people speaking to her that way, not because she demanded deference, but because people in her orbit had learned that smooth edges were the path of least resistance. This man hadn't gotten that message, or hadn't found it relevant. "Fine," she said, and returned to her call. Caleb wandered the way 9-year-olds wander, pulled from one thing to the next by whatever caught his attention. He went down the east hallway because the floor made a different sound there, followed the bend because he wanted to know what was around it, and stopped because at the end sat a girl in a wheelchair with a sketchpad on her knees and a pencil moving across the page. Sophie heard him stop. She didn't look up. Caleb stood there for a moment, assessing. He was not a child made uncomfortable by silence. He lived with a father who thought out loud only occasionally, and he had learned to occupy himself in quiet without treating it as a problem to fix. "Is that a bird?" he asked. Sophie didn't answer. Caleb moved a little closer, not crowding, just close enough to see. "It kind of looks like a hawk. I saw one last week at the park. It was eating something, but I couldn't tell what because it was far away, and my dad said probably a mouse. Mice are outside though, so I think it's okay." He said this with the certainty of a child who had arrived at a considered position. Sophie's pencil had slowed. She still didn't answer, but she shifted the page to an angle where the light hit it better. "My dad's fixing the bookshelves downstairs," Caleb continued, apparently satisfied to carry both ends of the conversation. "He says the wood is dehydrated. That means it needs oil. He says all old things need oil eventually." A pause. "Except people. People need water." He looked at the page. "That's actually really good. The wings look like they're moving." Sophie's pencil stopped. She looked at him. A direct look, level and unhurried. Caleb looked back without interpretation, without discomfort, simply receiving it. Daniel found them like that. 2 minutes later, Caleb still talking, now about a spider he'd noticed in the library windowsill, its geometric web, and Sophie no longer drawing but holding her pencil loosely, listening with the quality of attention that looked like stillness but wasn't. "Caleb." Daniel's voice was quiet but arrived with authority. Daniel looked at Sophie then, not at her chair, not at her brace, not at the neutral middle distance above her shoulder that adults sometimes aimed at when they weren't sure of the protocol. He looked at her the way he'd look at any child he'd found his son talking at uninvited. "I'm sorry about him," he said. "He means well. He just has a lot of thoughts and not enough of them stay internal." A pause. Very quietly, the corner of Sophie's mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Something thinking about becoming one. "It's okay," she said. 2 words. The first she'd said to anyone in the house in longer than she could have explained. Daniel nodded once, put a hand on Caleb's shoulder, and walked him back down the hall. That evening, Serena pulled up the hallway camera feed and found the timestamp. She watched it twice, the boy talking, the girl listening. The moment when Sophie's pencil slowed and stopped, and she turned to look at him with those steady, serious eyes. She had seen Sophie look like that before, a long time ago. Before the sessions, before the specialists, before everything became something to be managed. She didn't call Daniel's company to cancel the contract the way she'd been planning to do since 5 o'clock. Instead, she went down the hall and found the drawing Sophie had left on the window seat. A spider, careful, detailed, geometrically exact, the web rendered with precision that suggested the artist had actually studied the structure rather than guessed at it. Across the top, in Sophie's careful hand, was a single small word. Charlotte. Serena stood in the empty hallway, holding the drawing for a long time. She told herself she was there because she needed to return it to Sophie's room, put it with the others. She stood there anyway, in the quiet, holding it. It was on the 3rd morning that Daniel found out who Serena Calloway actually was. He had been working near the library door, fitting new felt pads to the base of the shelving, when he heard her voice from the adjacent sitting room, not the careful, controlled voice she used in the house, but a different register entirely. Sharp, precise, the voice of someone who had been making large decisions for a long time and had stopped finding it effortful. The board's position on the Harwick acquisition is not a suggestion, she said, to whoever was on the other end. I need the filing done by Thursday. If legal has concerns, they can be on my calendar at 7 tomorrow morning. A pause. No, Thursday. Daniel sat back on his heels. Then he looked down the hall toward where Mrs. Aldridge was moving between rooms, and he asked her, easily, the way you ask about something you expect to be unremarkable, who exactly owned this house? Mrs. Aldridge looked at him as if the question were slightly strange. Mrs. Calloway, she said. Serena Calloway. She runs Calloway Bio Group. Daniel looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the floor. Then he picked up the felt pad he'd set down and turned it over in his hands without using it. He knew the name. He had spent a year knowing that name. The way you know the name of something that cost you something, not with active anger, which fades, but with the low, permanent awareness of a fact that has worked its way into how you understand the world. Calloway Bio Group, the company that had reviewed Laura's grant application for the Community Pediatric Therapy Program. The company that had sent a form letter rejection 4 months before Laura died. Laura had read it at the kitchen table on a Saturday morning and then folded it carefully and put it in the drawer where she kept the things she didn't want to leave out where Caleb could ask about them. Daniel had found it later, after everything. He'd read it twice and then put it back. There was nothing to do with it. The program had limped along on smaller grants. The children it was meant to serve had gotten a fraction of what was designed for them. Laura had spent her last months writing letters to other funders, and she hadn't told him how discouraging it was because that was Laura. She protected the people she loved from the weight of things she thought they couldn't carry. She was wrong about that, but he had never been able to tell her so. He sat in the library for a long time after Mrs. Aldridge went back to her work. He thought about leaving. He considered it with the serious attention he gave to things that required a real decision. He could pack his tools, give a professional reason, have someone else finish the shelving. It would be reasonable. It would be a clean exit from a situation he hadn't agreed to walk into. Then Caleb appeared in the doorway. Is the girl going to be there again today? He asked. The one at the door? Daniel looked at his son. Caleb's face was open and curious and completely free of the calculations that adults ran quietly in the background of every interaction. I think so, Daniel said. Good, Caleb said simply, and went back down the hall. Daniel looked at the shelving for a moment. Then he picked up his tools and went back to work. The next morning, Daniel set up in the library with his tools in the logical order he'd developed over years. Not military precise, but each thing where it would be when he needed it without looking. He had a habit when he worked of narrating to Caleb in a low, even voice, not instructions, more like thinking aloud, the running commentary of a man accustomed to explaining the world to someone still learning it. This is white oak, he said, running a hand along the shelving. You can tell by the grain, see how it rays out? White oak is harder than red, takes longer to dry out, but when it does, it goes farther. You have to bring it back slowly, oil it, let it sit, oil it again. You can't rush it, or you push the treatment in too fast, and the wood can't absorb it right. Caleb was on an overturned supply crate with a granola bar, half listening, watching a fly work its way across the window. But Caleb was not the only one listening. Sophie had arrived at the library doorway at 8:23 and positioned her wheelchair precisely at the threshold, not inside, not in the hallway, but on the line between them. She was drawing, or appeared to be. Her pencil moved across the page with the same focused efficiency it always did. But her eyes, when she thought no one tracked them, went to Daniel's hands. The way he listened to it before he touched it, pressing 2 fingers against the grain the way you'd press a hand to a forehead to check for fever. The way he talked about it like it was something that had opinions about what happened to it. She came back the next day. And the day after that, By the end of the first week, she had stopped pretending she was just passing through. She brought her pencils in their small tin case and arranged them along the edge of the work table and drew for the full morning, working on something that no one asked about and that she didn't explain. Caleb glanced over once and said it looked like the library. And she said yes, it was, and that was the longest exchange she'd had with anyone in the house in 4 months. 4 words, said without effort. Like language was something she'd simply chosen to use again rather than something that needed to be restored to her. On Thursday, Serena sent Dr. Voss. Renata Voss was one of the most credentialed pediatric movement therapists in Chicago. She arrived with a rolling case of assessment tools and the focused certainty of someone who had never had a session not go as planned. She found Sophie at the library doorway, greeted her by name, and asked in the careful, modulated voice of a professional whether Sophie was ready to work on some movement exercises. Sophie closed her sketch pad, set it on her lap, turned her wheelchair 45 degrees to face the wall. Dr. Voss tried for 20 minutes. Patient, skilled, everything she was paid to be. She got nothing. Sophie sat with her face to the wall and waited for it to be over. After Voss left, Serena found Daniel in the library, fitting a new piece of joinery into a cabinet corner and checking the angle with a small brass level. "My daughter is not entertainment for your work sessions," Serena said. Daniel set the level down. "I haven't been entertaining her. I've been fixing bookshelves. She sits in that doorway every morning." "I know. And you don't think that's something to address?" He picked up the level, checked the angle, set it down again. "She's sitting in a doorway. She's not in anyone's way. She's not doing any harm. She's drawing." A pause. "And listening, I think. But I haven't asked her to." Serena stood in that same doorway, the one her daughter occupied every morning, and found she didn't have an immediate answer to that. "She has a therapist," Serena said. "I know. I saw her leave." The silence between them had weight. "I'm not doing anything to your daughter," Daniel said. "I'm just here." That evening, long after Serena had gone upstairs and Caleb was asleep in the guest room, Mrs. Aldridge had offered without being asked. Daniel was collecting his tools when he heard a small knock from the hallway. Tentative. Barely loud enough to qualify, Sophie was at the doorway. She wheeled herself a foot inside the room the first time he'd seen her cross the threshold and held out a folded piece of paper. He took it. He unfolded it. A drawing. A man leaning over a workbench, hands moving along the surface of something long and flat, the posture exact in its observation. The slight forward tilt, the weight shifted left when the right hand worked. Beside the workbench, a small figure on a crate, and at the edge of the frame, barely there, the wheel of a chair. He looked up at Sophie. She had already turned and was wheeling herself back down the hall, unhurried, not looking back. He refolded the drawing carefully and put it in his chest pocket. The house was very quiet. It was 11:47 on a Thursday night when Serena came downstairs and found the library light still on. Daniel was cross-legged on the floor with a piece of shelving across his knees, working a cloth along the grain with the slow patience of someone in no hurry to be anywhere else. He looked up when she appeared. He didn't look surprised to see her at midnight. He didn't arrange his face into anything. She came into the room, pulled the wooden stool from the wall where it lived between his work sessions, and sat down. She had not planned to sit down. She sat down anyway. "I spent $8 million, she said. It came out without the frame. She usually gave it the context, the accounting of what each dollar had accomplished. Just the number, in the empty room. 4 years. Best specialists in the country. The equipment. Every program anyone told me was correct. She looked at the shelving he was working on, and she still won't look at me." Daniel didn't say he was sorry. He didn't say he understood. He set the cloth on the floor beside him. "Have you ever just sat with her?" he asked. "Not with a goal, not working towards something, just sat next to her." The question arrived without softness, not unkindly, but straight. Serena opened her mouth. The honest answer came before she could dress it in something more manageable. Not in a long time, she said. Why not? Because sitting isn't doing anything. She heard herself say it, heard how it sounded. Because if I stop moving, I have to think about what all the moving was for. The library was still. Outside, distantly, a car passed on the street. Thomas, she said, the first time in 4 years she'd said his name in a room that didn't contain a therapist or a lawyer. He died, and I looked at Sophie and I thought she still has me. That's enough. I can be enough. She stopped. But I turned being enough into something I had to prove, and I've been proving it ever since, and she's been sitting at a window seat drawing spiders, and She stopped again. Daniel was listening the way he worked completely, without distraction, without the part of his attention already composing what to say next. My wife's name was Laura, he said, after a while. She died 3 years ago. She was 34. He held the cloth without using it. Before she got sick, she spent 2 years trying to get funding for a community therapy program for kids who couldn't afford the specialists. One of the companies she applied to was Callaway Bio Group. Serena went still. They rejected the application 4 months before she died, Daniel said. She didn't tell me why. I found out later, through someone who knew the board. She didn't want me to carry it. That was Laura. The silence that followed had the weight of 2 people who have set something down in the same room at the same time and are now both looking at it. I didn't know, Serena said. I know you didn't. He said it without accusation and without generosity as a simple fact. I'm not telling you because I want something. I'm telling you because you told me something real, and it deserved something real back. She sat on the stool for a long time after that. Daniel went back to working the oil into the wood, slowly, with the patience of a man who understood that you couldn't rush what needed to soak in. She didn't go back upstairs until almost 1. The email arrived 11 days later, forwarded by Serena's assistant with the subject line, FWD, Library Project Supplemental Documents, and a note that said accidentally included in the project file, please disregard if not relevant. Daniel opened it at his kitchen table. It was a board meeting summary from 4 years ago, clean corporate formatting, the kind of document that made large decisions look tidy. Agenda Item 6, Community Pediatric Therapy Initiative, Grant Application Review. The recommendation had been to decline. The reasoning cited program scope, liability considerations, and insufficient alignment with core business priorities. At the bottom, a list of board members who had approved the recommendation. Serena Callaway's name was the first one. He read it twice, set his phone face down on the table. His coffee had gone cold while he was reading and he didn't notice. He sat for a while with his hands flat on the table, looking at nothing in particular, doing the thing he did when something needed to be absorbed before he could act on it, just sitting with it, letting it settle into the correct place. He thought about the form letter in the drawer. He thought about Laura at the kitchen table that Saturday morning, reading it once with her face still and composed, and then folding it with those precise, careful folds and putting it away. He thought about the months after, when she was already sick and still writing to other funders, and how she had never once said to him the name of the company that had said no. Not once. He had learned it later, from someone who had worked on the grant with her. He had thought about it for a year and then made himself stop thinking about it, because there was no direction that thinking led. He drove to the Callaway house that morning, arriving at the usual time, and did the work he'd come to do. He was quieter than usual. Caleb noticed and asked if he was tired, and Daniel said yes, a little. By 2 in the afternoon he had packed his tools and told Mrs. Aldridge he'd be back the following Monday. He went out the side entrance, without seeking out Serena. Without passing the window seat. Sophie was at the library doorway at 2:15 when he didn't come back. She sat there for 10 minutes, very still, the sketchpad open on her lap, but the pencil not moving. Then she wheeled herself to the small sitting room, where Serena had left her phone charging on the side table. She scrolled through the contacts with the careful deliberation of a child who had learned to be precise with technology. She found the number. She pressed call. It rang 3 times. "Sophie?" Caleb's voice, surprised, unguarded. "Caleb." Her voice was low and level. She had chosen the word exactly. "Where's your dad?" The sound from the sitting room doorway wasn't loud. Serena had been passing in the hall, heading toward the kitchen, phone already in her hand for the next call, and she stopped. Because she heard Sophie's voice, clear and purposeful and fully formed, asking a question, having a conversation. And the stopping was involuntary, the kind that happens when your body understands something before your mind has caught up to it. She stood in the hallway with her hand pressed flat against the doorframe. She didn't move. She didn't breathe. Not really. Not in any way that counted. Sophie did not see her. She was still on the phone, turned toward the window, the pale afternoon light catching the line of her profile. The shape of her jaw, which was Thomas's jaw, which was the thing about Sophie's face that still sometimes arrived without warning and took something from Serena's chest. She was wearing the blue cardigan with the small bird embroidered on the collar, the one that had been Thomas's favorite. Serena had never told her that. She had watched Sophie reach for it on hard days and had said nothing. Serena's hand tightened on the doorframe until the knuckles went pale. She stood there until Sophie ended the call and set the phone back on the table with the same careful precision she brought to everything. Then Sophie turned her wheelchair and saw her mother standing in the doorway. They looked at each other, and Sophie's expression was not closed, not the careful wall that had been there for 4 months. It was something more complicated than that, something that was watching to see what Serena would do next. Serena drove to the workshop 2 hours later. It was on the ground floor of a building in Bridgeport Narrow Street, working storefronts, the kind of block that had outlasted several cycles of the city changing around it. The rolling door was halfway up. She could hear sanding from inside, even and methodical. She knocked on the metal frame. The sanding stopped. Daniel came to the door with sawdust on his shirt and looked at her directly, without arrangement. "I know you read the file," she said. "Your assistant sent it by mistake." "I know." She had practiced a version of this in the car that was more composed. "You had every reason to walk out." "I did walk out." He leaned against the doorframe. "I came back to get my tools." "That's not why you came back." He didn't answer that. "She called Caleb this afternoon," Serena said. She asked where you were. It was the first full sentence she'd spoken in 4 months. "I was in the hallway. I heard her." She paused. "I sat down on the floor right there. My knees just went." The street behind her was quiet. The late afternoon light had gone gray and flat, the kind that drained color from things without making them less real. "Did you know about the program?" Daniel asked. When the board voted, she could have said she hadn't been closely tracking every agenda item that week, which was true. She could have said she trusted her board's judgment, which was also true. She found she didn't want to offer either. "I signed off on it," she said. "I don't remember the details. I was 3 weeks past Thomas's death, and I was doing everything I could to keep the company from coming apart. I signed off on things I should have read more carefully." She stopped. "That is not an excuse." "I'm not offering it as one." "No," he said. "It's not. I know what it cost." She said it without looking away. "I know it isn't something that gets fixed. I know you know that too." She let a breath out slowly. "But Sophie called Caleb, and I drove here, and I'm asking you to come back. Not only for her." A pause. "For me too. I'm asking for me as well." Daniel was quiet for a moment. Behind him, a radio played somewhere in the back of the workshop, low and indistinct. The sawdust in the air caught what remained of the light. "Caleb asked me this morning if we were going back," he said finally. "What did you tell him?" "I told him I didn't know yet." He picked up his jacket from the hook beside the door. looked at her for a moment, the look of a person who has made a decision and is taking one beat to acknowledge its weight. "Let me call Caleb," he said. "He's at the neighbor's." He called from the truck with the door open, the November air coming in around him. Caleb answered on the second ring. "Are we going to Sophie's?" Caleb asked, before Daniel had said a word. "Yeah," Daniel said. "We're going." The house was quiet when they arrived. Mrs. Aldridge let them in without asking questions, which was one of the things Daniel had come to appreciate about her. She understood, without being told, which moments required management and which required simply stepping back. Daniel started down the hall toward the library, Caleb moving slightly ahead the way he always did, pulled forward by the simple fact of having a destination. Sophie was in the hallway in the hallway itself, positioned between the two, as if she had been deciding which direction to move in and had paused mid-decision. She had her sketch pad in her lap, but the pencil was in its case. She wasn't drawing. She was just there, in the hall, waiting in the careful, dignified way of someone who has decided to wait and is not going to let the waiting diminish her. She looked at Daniel. She looked at Caleb. Her expression had the quality of someone who has been waiting and is very careful not to show how much. Caleb said, "Hey." Easily, without ceremony. Sophie said, "Hey." The same way. They went into the library together, Caleb talking almost immediately about something he'd read about the rings of Saturn, Sophie's chair crossing the threshold without hesitation past the line she'd held for 2 weeks, into the room, to the work table where her sketch pad was already open. Daniel picked up his tool bag and followed. Serena came to the library doorway 20 minutes later. She stood at the threshold and looked in Caleb on the supply crate, mid-sentence, Sophie at the work table, pencil moving, Daniel fitting a cabinet hinge, checking the alignment, his movements steady and unhurried. Sophie looked up. She saw her mother in the doorway. She held up the sketch pad. It was the drawing from before the man at the workbench, the child on the crate, the wheel at the frame's edge. But she had added to it. A woman in the doorway now, one hand on the frame. The face was simple, mostly eyes, and the suggestion of a mouth, but the posture was right. The tilt of the shoulders, the careful way of standing that Sophie had been watching for 4 months without anyone knowing she was watching. Serena crossed the library floor. She had words prepared, an apology that had been forming in her chest for hours, the kind that knew it wouldn't be sufficient and was trying to be honest rather than adequate. She looked at the drawing. She looked at Sophie's face. She sat down on the floor beside Sophie's chair. Not in a chair. Not on the stool. On the floor, back against the shelving that smelled of new oil and old wood, her suit jacket pulling slightly at this angle, both legs out in front of her, the way people sit when they have decided comfort isn't the point. Sophie lowered the sketch pad to her lap. They sat beside each other without speaking. The library continued around them. Caleb's commentary, the small sounds of Daniel's work, the particular quiet of a room being used by people comfortable in it. After a while, 2 minutes, 5, neither of them counting, Sophie said, "Stay here, okay?" She said it quietly, facing forward, not looking at her mother. But she said it. Serena said, "Okay." She didn't move. She stayed. In the weeks that followed, Sophie started crossing the library threshold without pause. She began staying after Caleb left, sitting at the work table while Daniel finished for the day, drawing in the companionable quiet of someone who had decided a room was safe enough to occupy without watching the door. Serena made a call to the director of the community pediatric therapy program that Laura had spent 2 years building the case for. The program had never been fully funded, running on smaller grants, operating at a fraction of its intended scale, serving a fraction of the children it was designed to reach. Serena funded it through a private foundation established for no purpose other than this. Her name appeared nowhere in the paperwork. The program's director received notification of a multi-year operating grant from an anonymous donor and sent a letter to the foundation's address that said simply, "Whoever you are, thank you. She'll never know how much this matters." Serena read the letter once, folded it carefully, and put it in the drawer where she kept the photograph of Thomas, the one where his eyes were exactly the shape Sophie had inherited. Daniel finished the library restoration on a Thursday in early December. He worked through the morning with Caleb on the supply crate and Sophie at the work table, and in the early afternoon he ran the cloth one final time along the shelving and stepped back and looked at what he had done. The wood had come back, the way old oak comes back slowly, and then completely, the grain alive with oil, the color deepening to what it had been when someone first cared about it. The joinery was clean, the cabinet doors hung level, the room smelled of pine and linseed, and the particular old book smell that had been there before any of them arrived, waiting patiently to be part of a room worth being in again. "Done," Caleb announced from his crate. "Done," Daniel agreed. Sophie looked at the shelving, then at Daniel. "It's beautiful," she said. Precise. Exactly what she meant. "Thank you," he said, the same way. 3 months later, Serena gave Sophie the corner of the library as a permanent drawing space, a proper table at the right height, a lamp that angled any direction, shelves fitted for her pencils and papers, and a small window looking out over the back garden. Not the hallway window seat. Her own window, in a room that had become, without announcement, a place where people came and stayed and did not need a reason to explain why they were there. Daniel came on Saturdays. Caleb and Sophie had arrived at the easy friendship that children sometimes make, built not on shared history but on shared frequency, two people on the same wavelength who recognize each other without needing to explain it. They spent Saturday mornings in the library, Caleb reading or constructing something from whatever materials he could locate, Sophie drawing, talking in the unbothered, intermittent way of children who don't need conversation to be continuous for it to be real. One Saturday morning, Serena brought 2 cups of coffee into the library. She set one beside Daniel on the work table. He didn't say thank you. He moved his papers slightly to make room for her to sit beside him on the bench. She sat down. That was enough. On a Sunday in early March, Sophie came to the kitchen with a drawing she'd been working on for 3 weeks. She put it on the table and stood with her hands in the pockets of her cardigan, waiting. A house, small, with a pitched roof and a chimney trailing smoke. 4 figures in front, a tall man, a woman with her hair pulled back, 2 children, one in a chair, all of them facing out. At the bottom, in Sophie's careful hand, one word, home. Serena picked it up. She stood at the kitchen table and looked at it for a long moment at the figures that were not a wish or a projection, but a record of something already present, already real, already living in the rooms of this house. She folded the drawing once and put it in the pocket of her jacket. Not a drawer. Not a frame. Her pocket, where she could reach for it and find it. Serena Calloway had believed, for 4 years, that enough will directed at the right problems could recover anything. She wasn't entirely wrong. She was missing one thing, the understanding that some things don't come back through effort. They come back through stillness, through being willing to stop long enough to let what you've been reaching for find its way to you. It had taken a man who smelled of sawdust, a 9-year-old boy who could not be quiet about anything, and one small girl with a sketch pad to teach her that. Sophie had known it longest. She had been sitting at a window, drawing what she saw, waiting with the particular patience of a child who has not yet been taught that patience is something you run out of waiting for someone to stop moving long enough to see her back. One quiet question had opened the door. Everything else had walked through it.